They called her weak in training, a label that cut deeper than any physical wound. So when she brutally knocked out 5 Marines, the world finally understood what true strength looked like. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. John Calloway stepped off the bus at Parris Island in June 1997, his legs stiff from the long journey. The humid South Carolina air immediately clung to his skin like a second uniform, thick and oppressive. Around him, other recruits stumbled forward, their faces masks of anticipation and dread. John took a deep breath, surveying what would be his home for the next 12 weeks, a sprawling training facility designed to break civilians and rebuild them as Marines. At 24, John was older than most recruits, and significantly smaller. His 5'8" frame carried only 150 pounds, making him easy to underestimate. But beneath his standard-issue uniform lay his secret weapon, a black belt in martial arts, a skill honed through years of rigorous training with his father, Colonel Robert Calloway. "Move it, recruit!" A drill instructor's voice cut through the air, sending John and the others scrambling into formation. As he fell in line, memories of his father flooded back, the legendary Marine whose mysterious disappearance in Iraq 5 years ago had left nothing but questions and a folded flag. The sun beat down mercilessly as they stood at attention. John's eyes remained fixed forward, but his mind was calculating. No one on that bus could have known his true purpose. While the others had come to become Marines, John had come for answers. Answers about Operation Mirage, about his father's final mission, about the powerful men who had buried the truth beneath layers of classified reports and convenient lies. "Welcome to hell," the drill instructor announced, pacing before them like a predator. "Most of you won't make it. Some of you don't deserve to." His eyes lingered briefly on John, then moved to the few female recruits in the group. John remained perfectly still, his face betraying nothing. For years, the Marine Corps had dismissed people like him, those deemed too small, too quiet, or carrying names that reminded certain officers of uncomfortable truths. Colonel Robert Calloway had made enemies with his principles, and now his son stood on the same ground, carrying the same name. That evening, as the recruits settled into the barracks, exhausted from their first taste of Marine discipline, John lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. His father's dog tags pressed against his chest beneath his shirt, a reminder of his mission. Before the month was through, he would change the entire Marine Corps, not for glory, but for justice. He closed his eyes, recalling his father's words, "Truth doesn't stay buried forever, son. It just needs someone brave enough to dig." And dig he would, no matter how many powerful men had packed the earth above it. The first week at Parris Island was designed to break every recruit who stepped off that bus. The drill instructors shouted until their voices went hoarse. The physical demands pushed bodies to collapse, and the psychological warfare stripped away civilian identities. But John Calloway had been broken and rebuilt long before he ever set foot on these grounds. Back on the frigid plains of Montana, his father had subjected him to training that would make even seasoned Marines wince. Colonel Robert Calloway believed preparation meant survival, and he'd ensured his son could endure anything. John remembered those dawn runs through snow, combat drills in freezing rain, and tactical problems solved under extreme duress. The memory of his father's voice, stern but never cruel, kept him centered amid the chaos of basic training. John deliberately positioned himself in the middle of every formation, ran at the center of the pack during physical training, and performed adequately but never exceptionally on every test. Invisibility was his strategy. Drawing attention meant scrutiny, and scrutiny could unravel everything. Yet despite his careful mediocrity, he felt eyes tracking his movements. Staff Sergeant Michael Smith watched him with unsettling intensity. The towering instructor, with a jaw that looked carved from granite and shoulders broad as a doorway, seemed to sense something different about this unassuming recruit. When Smith barked orders, his gaze lingered on John a heartbeat longer than the others. "Calloway, your form is garbage," Smith would shout, though John's push-ups were textbook perfect. "Reset and give me 20 more." The staff sergeant had assembled a loyal cadre around him, 4 instructors who shared his apparent disdain for the Marine Corps' new integration policies. Sergeant Robert Johnson, barely 30 but already hardened by combat tours, patrolled the barracks with predatory focus. Luis Davis used his massive frame to intimidate, looming over female recruits during inspections. Paul Brown's cutting remarks left psychological wounds deeper than any physical training, while Stephen Miller observed everything in calculating silence. Together, they formed a united front against what they viewed as the weakening of their beloved Corps. Their skepticism toward female recruits and smaller-statured men like John wasn't just professional concern. It was weaponized bias, aimed with precision at those they deemed unworthy. During evening cleanup, John overheard Smith muttering to his cohorts, "Integration is gonna get good Marines killed, mark my words." John scrubbed the floor harder, eyes down, ears open. He'd survived this first week, just as he'd survived his father's training, by adapting, enduring, and revealing nothing. The instructors might control this base, but they couldn't see inside his mind, and that was where John Calloway was truly dangerous. Staff Sergeant Michael Smith's contempt hung in the air like the South Carolina humidity. Every morning, the towering instructor paced before the recruits with calculated precision, his granite jaw clenched as he searched for weakness. The integration program was his personal affront, a stain on what he considered the Corps' legacy. "This is the end of the line for you," he sneered at John Calloway during morning formation, his Texas drawl stretching each syllable into a challenge. The instructor's eyes narrowed, studying the smaller recruit with unconcealed disdain. "You think you belong here? Your daddy might have worn the uniform, but that don't mean you deserve to." John stood motionless, his breathing measured and controlled. The mention of his father sent a familiar chill down his spine, but his face revealed nothing. He had perfected this stillness years ago on the cold Montana plains, where Colonel Robert Calloway had drilled him relentlessly. The young recruit's eyes remained fixed forward, cold steel reflecting nothing back. Behind Smith stood his loyal cadre. Sergeant Robert Johnson shifted his weight impatiently, eager for confrontation. Davis flexed his impressive arms, while Brown smirked at what he perceived as easy prey. Miller observed silently from the back, his expression unreadable. "Sir, yes, sir," John replied, voice neutral and controlled. Smith circled him like a predator. "Louder, recruit, or did they send me a mouse instead of a Marine?" "Sir, yes, sir." The words exploded from John's chest, startling even the seasoned instructor. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across Smith's face. Surprise, perhaps even recognition. He recovered quickly, barking orders for push-ups before moving to his next target. As John dropped to the ground, he caught Maria Garcia's glance from 3 positions down. The athletic recruit from Chicago gave him an almost imperceptible nod of respect. She too understood what it meant to be underestimated. Throughout the grueling morning exercises, John maintained his place in the middle of the pack, never first, never last, never drawing unnecessary attention. He had learned from childhood that the appearance of weakness was his greatest strength. People revealed themselves to those they didn't fear. In the back of his mind, his father's words echoed with crystal clarity, "Never show your hand until it's time to strike." The colonel had repeated this mantra during countless training sessions, his voice steady even as John's muscles trembled with exhaustion. Now, as Smith shouted commands that sent recruits scrambling across the parade ground, John cataloged every detail: the instructor's subtle limp, the way his eyes lingered too long on certain recruits, the careful distance he maintained from others. The truth about his father was here somewhere, and John would find it, no matter how many push-ups it took. The days at Paris Island blurred into a relentless haze of sweat, mud, and shouted insults. John Calloway kept his head down but his eyes open, cataloging every detail that might prove useful. Marine training was designed to break recruits down, but for John, it was an opportunity to observe his potential adversaries when their guards were lowest. During the grueling obstacle courses, he noticed how Sergeant Robert Johnson always shifted his weight before barking orders, favoring his right knee. An old injury, perhaps, carefully hidden, but visible to anyone paying attention. The sergeant compensated with extra aggression, as if volume could mask vulnerability. Luis Davis, despite his imposing physique, hesitated fractionally before each command, a tell that suggested he was following someone else's script rather than his own instincts. The muscular instructor seemed to need silent confirmation from Smith before making decisions, revealing the chain of influence John could potentially exploit. Paul Brown strutted around the training grounds with practiced arrogance, but his eyes betrayed insecurity whenever female recruits outperformed their male counterparts. His discomfort was palpable during integration exercises, his knuckles whitening around his clipboard. Most interesting was Stephen Miller, the quietest of Smith's cadre. While the others shouted and intimidated, Miller observed from the periphery. John caught him several times with trembling hands when he thought no one was watching, a man carrying a burden he couldn't share. But Staff Sergeant Michael Smith was different. Unlike his subordinates, the towering instructor revealed no obvious weaknesses. His granite jaw remained set, his posture perfect, his commands precise. Yet something in his gaze when it fell on John suggested recognition, not of John himself, but perhaps of something John represented. During the fourth morning's run, Smith pulled alongside John, matching his pace effortlessly, while the recruit struggled to maintain his deliberately average performance. "Calloway," he said, voice low enough that only John could hear. "That name sounds familiar." John kept his eyes forward, breath measured. "Common name, sir." Smith's laugh held no humor. "Nothing common about you, recruit. I'm watching." The instructor accelerated away, leaving John with the distinct impression that Smith wasn't just enforcing discipline. He was hunting for something. As John lay in his bunk that night, the barracks filled with the sounds of exhausted recruits. He realized he needed allies. Maria Garcia had shown potential, and Lucia Costa's silent watchfulness suggested she noticed more than she revealed. But trust was a currency John couldn't afford to spend carelessly. Not when Smith's eyes followed him with that mixture of curiosity and something darker, something that felt uncomfortably like recognition. On the seventh day, John Calloway shuffled into the mess hall with the other recruits, his tray clutched firmly in his hands. The cacophony of metal utensils against plastic trays couldn't mask the weight of stares boring into him from every direction. Some eyes held curiosity, many more showed dismissal, and a select few burned with open hostility. At the corner table, Staff Sergeant Smith held court with his loyal cadre. The 5 instructors huddled together like wolves, planning their next hunt, their laughter echoing off the institutional walls whenever female recruits passed by. Sergeant Robert Johnson nudged Louise Davis, pointing at a recruit who struggled with her heavy tray. Their snickers were barely contained, a performance meant to be witnessed. "Keep moving," barked Miller from across the room, his usually silent demeanor breaking only to enforce the perpetual motion expected during meals. John slid onto the bench, careful to maintain the unassuming posture he'd cultivated. A slight figure dropped onto the seat beside him, Maria Garcia, the wiry athlete whose bunk neighbored his in the barracks. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, so tight it seemed to strain against her scalp. "That's Smith," she whispered, her Chicago accent barely detectable as she nodded toward the instructor table. "He hates the integration program. Just keep your head down." John gave a slight nod, shoveling tasteless potatoes into his mouth. What Maria couldn't know was that he'd already marked the towering staff sergeant as his primary target. the possible key to unlocking the truth behind Colonel Robert Calloway's disappearance. Smith's booming laugh cut through the mess hall again as Brown made some remark, his eyes fixed on Lucia Costa, who moved through the space like a ghost, silent and precise in her movements. The female recruit never reacted, her face a careful mask that John recognized all too well. "They've been worse since the new directive came down," Maria continued, keeping her voice low. "More women, more scrutiny from headquarters. Smith thinks we're diluting the core." John studied the instructor's granite jaw, the way his eyes constantly scanned the room, the calculated nature of his contempt. This wasn't just the resistance of an old-school Marine to change. This was something deeper, something personal. "How long have you been watching them?" John asked, surprising himself with the question. Maria's eyes widened slightly. "Since day one. My sister was in the program last year. She warned me about him." She hesitated. "Why are you asking?" John returned to his meal. Just trying to survive, like everyone else. But survival wasn't his mission. As Smith's gaze briefly locked with his across the crowded mess hall, John felt a current of recognition pass between them. The instructor's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly before moving on. The game had begun. The barracks fell silent, save for the occasional snore and whispered breaths of exhausted recruits. John Calloway lay on his back, eyes fixed on the ceiling, his mind racing despite his body's desperate plea for rest. Every muscle ached from the day's grueling exercises, but sleep remained elusive. He methodically replayed the day's events, analyzing each interaction like chess moves on an invisible board. The way Staff Sergeant Smith's eyes had lingered on him during formation, the careful distance the other instructors maintained when Smith was present, the hushed conversations that stopped whenever recruits approached. Smith was the gatekeeper here, controlling who accessed what information, which records remained visible, and ultimately, which recruits succeeded or failed. The instructor's influence extended beyond the training grounds, creating an invisible web of power throughout the base. A memory surfaced from John's childhood in Montana, his father sitting on their wooden porch as the sun set behind the mountains. Colonel Robert Calloway's hands moved with practiced precision as he cleaned his service pistol, each component laid out in perfect order on a worn cloth. "Pay attention, son," his father had said, voice steady as always. "The most dangerous men aren't the ones who hate you. They're the ones who fear you." The colonel had reassembled the weapon with fluid movements that John had memorized through years of observation. Fear makes men unpredictable, makes them desperate. John shifted on his bunk, the memory fading as he returned to the present. What did Smith fear? The integration program changing his carefully constructed world? Or was it something more personal? Something connected to Iraq, to Operation Mirage, to the disappearance that had left a teenage boy without a father. In the dim light, John glanced toward Maria Garcia's bunk. The recruit was sleeping fitfully, her face tense even in rest. Across the room, Lucia remained perfectly still, though John suspected she wasn't asleep either. Everyone here carried their own burdens, their own reasons for enduring this crucible. John's hand instinctively moved to his chest, feeling the outline of his father's dog tags beneath his shirt. Whatever Smith was hiding, whatever connection he might have to the colonel's disappearance, John would uncover it. The instructor's fear, whatever its source, was a weakness John could exploit. Tomorrow, he would begin digging deeper. The base library might hold records, or perhaps Anna Johnson could be approached carefully. Even Jack Murphy's bar outside the gates might yield information from veterans who remembered Operation Mirage. John closed his eyes, forcing his breathing to slow. He needed rest for what was coming. The game had begun, and Smith had no idea who he was really facing. By the second week at Paris Island, John Calloway had begun to see the patterns. The South Carolina heat was relentless. But it wasn't the weather that made recruits break down in tears. It was the calculated pressure applied by Staff Sergeant Michael Smith and his hand-picked team of instructors. Smith had surrounded himself with men who mirrored his contempt for change. Sergeant Robert Johnson, barely 30, was the attack dog, quick to anger and quicker to punish. His youth made him dangerous. He had something to prove. Davis relied on his imposing physique, towering over recruits during inspections, his brittle ego visible only in the way his jaw tightened when challenged. Brown strutted through the barracks like he owned them, arrogance masking deep insecurity that John could spot from a mile away. And then there was Miller, the silent observer who never raised his voice, but whose eyes missed nothing. "They're always watching," Maria whispered, during a rare moment between drills. Her Chicago toughness had hardened into something more brittle, a defensive shell forming around her. The athletic recruit no longer smiled, her responses becoming clipped and precise, just enough to avoid punishment. 2 recruits had already packed their bags. One broke down during night exercises, sobbing uncontrollably until the medical staff intervened. The other simply disappeared between evening formation and morning roll call, unable to withstand another day of targeted humiliation. John noticed that Lucia Costa had adopted a different strategy altogether. The quiet recruit had become practically invisible, moving through training with mechanical precision. She spoke only when directly addressed, her eyes always focused on some middle distance. It was survival through ghosting, becoming so unremarkable that the predators looked elsewhere for easier targets. "Formation in 2 minutes," Johnson barked, his voice carrying across the yard. "Anyone late runs until sunset." As they lined up under the merciless sun, John maintained his position in the middle of the pack, not standing out, not falling behind. He caught Smith watching him from the shade, the instructor's expression unreadable. Next to him stood Davis and Brown, a wall of hostility directed primarily at the female recruits. The message was unmistakable. You are being watched, judged, and set up to fail. This wasn't just training. It was elimination. John understood the game now. Smith wasn't just a difficult instructor. He was a man with something to hide, something connected to Colonel Robert Calloway's disappearance. And these men were his insurance policy. John tightened his core as they began push-ups, keeping count in his head while cataloging every interaction, every glance between the instructors. Knowledge was power, and he was gathering it piece by piece. John Calloway maintained a careful middle ground during training, never excelling enough to draw attention, yet never failing so badly that he'd become a target. His father's lessons on tactical observation served him well as he watched the dynamics unfold around him. Staff Sergeant Michael Smith had created a system that functioned like clockwork. The cadre, Johnson, Davis, Brown, and Miller, operated as extensions of Smith's will, closing ranks whenever questions arose. John noticed how they scrutinized the female recruits with particular intensity, documenting every stumble, every moment of hesitation, every sign of weakness. 3 seconds slower than yesterday, Costa, Smith would bark at Lucia, though her time had actually improved. When another female recruit dropped from exhaustion during a run, Brown made her complete 50 push-ups as the others watched. The message was clear: you don't belong here. The obstacle course loomed before them on a humid Thursday afternoon, the South Carolina sun beating down mercilessly. John watched Maria Garcia approach the rope climb with determination in her eyes. She had been pushing herself harder than most, aware of the extra scrutiny. Halfway up the rope, Maria's hand slipped. She managed to catch herself but landed awkwardly on her descent, her ankle twisting beneath her. The pain was immediate and visible, her ankle swelling before their eyes. Sergeant Robert Johnson was on her in seconds, his tall frame casting a shadow over her crumpled form. The youngest of Smith's followers, Johnson seemed the most eager to prove himself. "Get up, Garcia. The enemy won't wait for you to cry," he shouted, his voice carrying across the training ground. "You think a terrorist cares about your ankle? Get up or get out." John observed the scene carefully. This wasn't standard Marine Corps training procedure. This was theater, a calculated display designed to break not just Maria, but anyone watching who might consider challenging the status quo. The other recruits shifted uncomfortably, eyes averted. Maria attempted to stand, her face contorted with pain. She managed to get halfway up before collapsing again. Johnson's disgust was palpable, his contempt radiating like heat. "This is what happens when we lower our standards," he muttered, loud enough for nearby recruits to hear. John assessed the situation quickly. Maria needed medical attention. The swelling indicated a possible fracture or severe sprain. Johnson was using her injury as a teaching moment, a warning to anyone thinking of stepping out of line. In that moment, John recognized he faced a choice: maintain his careful invisibility or take action. Either way would have consequences. Either way would reveal something about him to Smith and his cadre. As Maria struggled again to stand, John made his decision. John Calloway took a deep breath, weighing his options as Maria Garcia lay on the ground, her face contorted in pain. The obstacle course loomed behind them, mud-slicked and imposing in the South Carolina humidity. This wasn't just about an injured recruit. It was a test, perhaps even a trap. "Permission to assist Recruit Garcia to medical, sir," John said, his voice steady despite the tension crackling through the air. He kept his posture respectful but firm, eyes forward. Sergeant Robert Johnson's face darkened with disdain. "Denied, Calloway. Garcia needs to learn that weakness has consequences." The young instructor's hand rested on his belt, his stance aggressive. John didn't back down. "Sir, with respect, the Corps teaches us that a Marine never leaves another Marine behind, sir." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, other recruits watched in tense silence, their exhausted bodies frozen in place. Johnson stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You questioning my orders, recruit?" Before John could respond, a shadow fell across them. Staff Sergeant Michael Smith approached with measured steps, his tall frame blocking the morning sun. The senior instructor surveyed the scene with cold calculation, taking in Maria's swollen ankle and John's resolute stance. "What's the situation here, Johnson?" Smith's Texas drawl cut through the tension. "Recruit Garcia fell, sir. Calloway's trying to play hero," Johnson replied, shooting John a venomous glance. Smith studied John with unnerving intensity. Something in his gaze shifted. Recognition, perhaps, or a memory stirring. For a heartbeat, John wondered if Smith saw Colonel Robert Calloway in his son's defiance. "Take her to medical," Smith finally ordered, his decision technically by the book, but delivered with unmistakable contempt. "You've got 15 minutes, Calloway. Not a second more." As John helped Maria to her feet, Smith leaned in close. "Remember, Calloway, good intentions don't stop bullets. Only strength does." The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning. John met Smith's gaze directly, something few recruits dared. In that moment, something flickered in the instructor's eyes. A warning, a challenge, perhaps even fear. It was gone in an instant, replaced by the familiar mask of authority. "Yes, sir. Understood, sir," John replied, supporting Maria as they began limping toward medical. The other recruits parted silently, their expressions a mixture of awe and concern. Lucia Costa watched from the sidelines, her quiet assessment missing nothing. As they passed, John caught a glimpse of the cadre, Davis, Brown, and Miller, conferring with Smith, their attention fixed squarely on him. This small act of defiance had changed something. John had stepped out of the shadows, and now Smith knew he was watching. The game had shifted, and there would be no going back. The barracks fell into a hushed quiet as night descended over Paris Island. Maria Garcia limped through the door, her face tight with pain, but determined not to show weakness. John Calloway watched her navigate between the bunks, noting how she carefully distributed her weight to minimize pressure on her injured ankle. "Thanks for what you did out there," Maria whispered as she lowered herself onto the edge of his bunk. Most people wouldn't have done that. They'd have kept their heads down, especially with Johnson breathing fire. John shrugged, his eyes scanning the room out of habit. Anyone would have. "No," she insisted, leaning closer. "They wouldn't. I've been watching. Everyone's too scared of Smith and his crew. She studied his face with newfound curiosity. Why are you really here? Calloway, you're different from the others. The question hung between them, dangerous in its simplicity. John hesitated, weighing his options. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, yet isolation was equally dangerous. He needed allies, but choosing the wrong confidant could be fatal. My father served, he finally offered, a calculated fraction of the truth. Colonel Robert Calloway. He disappeared in Iraq. The official report says he died in action, but there were inconsistencies. I need answers. Maria's eyes widened slightly at the revelation. Your father was a colonel? She lowered her voice further. Is that why Smith watches you like you might explode? Maybe, John replied, though he suspected the connection ran much deeper. Sympathy softened her features as she nodded. My brother's in the Corps. I understand what it's like to need closure. John appreciated her words, but his attention had already divided. Across the barracks, Lucia Costa sat perfectly still on her bunk, her posture too rigid to be natural. Though she appeared to be reading a manual, her eyes occasionally flicked toward their conversation, too often and too intently to be coincidental. We should get some rest, John said, ending the conversation while keeping his tone casual. Early morning tomorrow. Maria squeezed his arm briefly before returning to her bunk. As she walked away, John mentally catalogued the interaction, adding it to his growing web of connections and suspicions. Was Lucia reporting to someone? Was Maria truly sympathetic, or was she fishing for information on behalf of Anna Johnson or someone else? The training facility had transformed into a chessboard, with John uncertain which pieces were allies and which were threats. As he lay back on his bunk, his father's voice echoed in his mind. Choose your confidence carefully, son. The wrong word to the wrong ear can be deadlier than any bullet. The third week of training brought a shift in the atmosphere at Paris Island. Staff Sergeant Michael Smith had intensified his campaign, appearing at every physical training session like a predatory shadow. His cadre, Johnson, Davis, Brown, and Miller, formed a wall of scrutiny around the recruits, their clipboards and stopwatches weapons of judgment. John Calloway noticed how the constant pressure affected his fellow recruits. During the obstacle course, a previously confident recruit froze atop the rope climb. In the barracks, whispered conversations died when others approached. Even Maria's usual resilience showed cracks as she nursed her healing ankle, her eyes darting nervously whenever an instructor entered. They're watching us more than usual, she whispered during a rare moment of privacy while cleaning their rifles. John nodded slightly. Not watching. Hunting. The young recruit had been documenting patterns in his mind, a skill his father had drilled into him during those long Montana winters. Smith's tactics were becoming more desperate, less controlled. The senior instructor would single out female recruits for demonstrations, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. But desperation created openings. Johnson, the youngest of Smith's loyalists, had begun arriving late to formations, dark circles under his eyes suggesting sleepless nights. Davis winced visibly when demonstrating hand-to-hand combat moves, his previous shoulder injury clearly worsening. Brown's arrogance had calcified into rigid predictability, and Miller, the silent observer, had developed a nervous habit of checking his watch every 17 minutes as if awaiting something. During an evening run, John deliberately positioned himself near the instructor's conversation. Harrison wants results, Smith hissed to Johnson. Find something on Calloway, or we're all exposed. Johnson's response was barely audible. Nothing in his records matches what we... Dig deeper, Smith interrupted. That night, as exhaustion settled over the barracks, John lay awake cataloging every detail. The mention of Harrison, the deputy base commander, confirmed his suspicions. This wasn't just about breaking recruits. This was about protecting secrets. His father's voice echoed in his memory. When they start making the stakes, son, that's when you move. Across the room, Lucia Costa watched him with unreadable eyes. John met her gaze briefly, wondering if she too had noticed the instructor's growing desperation. The silent recruit quickly looked away, but not before John caught something in her expression. Recognition, perhaps, or fear. The web was tightening. Smith was slipping, and John Calloway was ready. John was returning from the showers when he caught the hushed conversation between Staff Sergeant Michael Smith and Sergeant Robert Johnson near the instructor's office. The hallway was empty, the other recruits already settled in for the night. "Run a deeper check on Calloway. Find out who his father really was," Smith muttered, his voice barely audible but unmistakable. Johnson nodded, his young face tightening with purpose. "You think he knows something?" "I think that name isn't a coincidence," the staff sergeant replied before noticing John and immediately falling silent. The name Calloway hung in the air like a curse. John lowered his eyes and continued walking, his heart hammering against his ribs. The exchange confirmed what he'd suspected since his second week at Paris Island. Smith had a connection to his father's final mission. Operation Mirage wasn't just a ghost story. It was real, and these men knew about it. Back in the barracks, John lay on his bunk, one hand instinctively reaching for his father's dog tags hidden beneath his undershirt. The cool metal pressed against his skin, a constant reminder of Colonel Robert Calloway and the promise John had made at his empty grave. The tags weren't standard issue. They contained microscopic engravings that, when magnified, revealed coordinates. Part of a puzzle his father had left behind. Across the room, Maria sat on her bunk, watching him with concern. She'd noticed his distraction during evening formation, but John couldn't risk bringing her into this. Not yet. Not when the stakes had just risen exponentially. The flash drive hidden in the false bottom of his toiletry kit suddenly felt like a ticking bomb. John had carried it since the mysterious package arrived after his father's funeral. He'd never managed to crack the encryption, but he understood now that it contained evidence that powerful men would kill to suppress. Sleep evaded him that night. Every creak of the barracks, every shadow at the window seemed like a threat. The game had changed. He was no longer just a recruit trying to survive training. He was the last thread tying together a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of command. Tomorrow, he would need to accelerate his plans, find allies, secure the evidence. The men who had silenced his father were closing in, and John realized with cold certainty that Smith and his cadre wouldn't stop at intimidation. They'd eliminate any threat to their secret, even if it meant making another Calloway disappear. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Truth is the most dangerous weapon, son. Use it wisely." John closed his eyes, steeling himself for what was to come. John Calloway knew he was running out of time. After 3 weeks of training, the shadows around his father's disappearance only seemed to grow darker. During the 30-minute personal correspondence period, he approached Sergeant Anna Johnson with measured steps, keeping his face carefully neutral. "Requesting access to the base library for research, sir," he said, standing at attention. Anna studied him, her eyes narrowing slightly. Unlike the other instructors, she didn't seem to share their contempt for the newer recruits, but caution was still evident in her posture. "What kind of research, Calloway?" she asked, her voice low enough that the other recruits couldn't hear. "Military history, sir. For personal development." The female instructor frowned, considering his request. After a moment that stretched uncomfortably long, she nodded. 30 minutes, no more. I'll escort you myself." The library was small, but well organized, tucked away in a corner of the administrative building. John moved with purpose once inside, heading straight for the computer terminals. Anna watched from a distance, occasionally checking her watch. His fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, searching first for general information about military operations in Iraq during the early 90s. The official records were disappointingly sanitized. Operation Mirage appeared nowhere in the public databases. Sweat beaded on his forehead as precious minutes ticked by. He switched tactics, searching instead for personnel records from his father's unit. Most were classified, but the deployment rosters were accessible. John scrolled through name after name until his blood ran cold. There it was, Lieutenant Ethan Smith, attached to a reconnaissance unit in Iraq. The exact time and place of Colonel Robert Calloway's disappearance. Not Smith, Ethan Smith. The instructor who had been watching him like a hawk since day one was connected to his father's final mission. John carefully cleared the search history and stood up just as Anna approached. "Time's up, recruit." On the walk back to the barracks, John's mind raced. This wasn't coincidence. Staff Sergeant Smith knew everything, perhaps had even been there when his father vanished. The way the man looked at him sometimes, with that mixture of contempt and unease, it all made sense now. The flash drive hidden in his personal effects suddenly felt like it was burning through his belongings. Whatever secrets his father had died to protect, Smith was part of them. And if Smith recognized him as Robert Calloway's son, which seemed increasingly likely, then John's cover was already blown. He needed allies, he needed more information, but most of all, he needed to be careful. Because now he knew, Staff Sergeant Smith wasn't just a harsh instructor with outdated views. He was a man with something to hide. The recruits filed back to the barracks after another grueling day of hand-to-hand combat training. John Calloway's muscles ached, but he maintained perfect posture as he walked, a habit ingrained through years of his father's discipline. "You don't fight like the others," Maria Garcia said, falling into step beside him. Her voice was low, careful not to be overheard by the other recruits heading to the showers. John kept his expression neutral. "Just following the training manual." "No." Maria shook her head, her eyes narrowing. "Your movements are different, more precise, more efficient. You pull your strikes just before contact." She demonstrated with her hand, stopping a hair's breadth from his shoulder. "Like you're hiding something." John's pulse quickened, but his face revealed nothing. Years of practice had made his poker face impenetrable. Everyone has their own style. "Did your father teach you?" Maria pressed. "The colonel?" The question hung in the humid South Carolina air between them. On the surface, it seemed innocent enough, just one recruit curious about another's background. But John's instincts, honed through years of his father's paranoid preparation, screamed caution. "Basic self-defense," he replied vaguely, scanning the area for eavesdroppers. "Nothing special." Maria seemed about to say more when Lucia Costa walked past, her silent presence a reminder that walls had ears. The conversation died as naturally as it had begun. Later that night, as the barracks settled into the rhythmic breathing of exhausted recruits, John lay awake on his bunk, replaying the interaction. Was Maria genuinely curious or fishing for information? Was she reporting to someone else? Perhaps Anna Johnson? Or worse, Smith himself? His father's warnings echoed in his mind. Trust no one until they've earned it, and even then, keep your secrets close. Colonel Robert Calloway had lived by those words until his disappearance in Iraq. Now they were John's mantra. He stared at the ceiling, mentally cataloging his options. The flash drive hidden in his personal effects contained encrypted information that could blow the whole Operation Mirage conspiracy wide open, if he could access it. But he needed allies, evidence, and a foolproof plan. Smith and his cadre were watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. Harrison was circling closer. The window for action was narrowing daily. John closed his eyes, his father's training taking over as he regulated his breathing. He would find evidence linking Smith to his father's disappearance. He would identify trustworthy allies, perhaps Maria, if she proved genuine. And above all, he would never, ever let his guard down. The game was dangerous, but John had been preparing for it his entire life. Tomorrow would bring him one step closer to the truth, or to disaster. The fourth week of training brought live-fire exercises, turning Paris Island's already dangerous environment into a lethal chess match. John Calloway felt the weight of every round in his weapon as he positioned himself at the firing line, careful to maintain his deliberate mediocrity. Not too good, not too bad. just invisible enough. Staff Sergeant Michael Smith's scrutiny had become suffocating. The towering instructor hovered nearby. His granite jaw clenched as he analyzed John's every movement. But something had changed. Smith was no longer alone in his surveillance. Colonel Paul Harrison, the deputy base commander, had begun appearing at John's training sessions with alarming frequency. The colonel stood at the edge of the range, his weathered face impassive as he watched the recruits. His presence sent ice through John's veins. Harrison had been in Iraq during Operation Mirage, the same classified mission where Colonel Robert Calloway had disappeared. "Recruit Calloway," Smith barked, his Texas accent thick with contempt. "Your grouping is tighter than yesterday. Been practicing in your sleep?" John relaxed his aim slightly. "No, sir. Just lucky shots, sir." Smith's eyes narrowed, but he moved on to berate another recruit. John exhaled slowly, aware of Harrison's gaze still fixed on him from across the range. That night, as the barracks settled into uneasy quiet, a memory burned in John's mind. After his father's funeral, a ceremony with an empty casket, a package had arrived at their Montana home. Inside, a military-issue flash drive labeled simply Mirage. For years, he'd tried to access its contents, but the encryption had proven impenetrable. Now lying on his bunk, the pieces began to align. The drive wasn't just evidence, it was the key to exposing everything. His father hadn't disappeared. He'd been eliminated. And the men responsible were here, watching, waiting for John to make a mistake. Maria Garcia passed by his bunk, her limp barely noticeable now. "They're talking about you," she whispered, not breaking stride. "Harrison asked Smith for your file." John nodded imperceptibly. The walls were closing in. During the next day's tactical exercise, John noticed the cadre's formation had changed. Sergeant Robert Johnson shadowed him constantly. Davis and Brown positioned themselves at exits. Miller watched from elevated positions. They weren't just instructors anymore, they were sentries. Harrison approached Smith during a water break, their conversation just beyond earshot. But John caught the colonel's final words. "Before he becomes a problem." That night, John removed his father's dog tags from beneath his shirt, running his thumb over the worn metal. The flash drive hidden in his personal effects suddenly felt like a ticking bomb. Smith and Harrison were closing in, determined to silence him before the truth could surface. John knew he had to move first. The question was how, and who, if anyone, he could trust. Rain pounded against the metal roof of the barracks, creating a thunderous backdrop that masked all sound. John Calloway had just returned from evening drills when he caught a shadow moving near his footlocker. The silhouette was unmistakable. Maria Garcia was hunched over his belongings, fingers working methodically through his few personal items. In 3 swift steps, John closed the distance. His hand shot out, applying a pressure hold to her wrist that his father had perfected during their training sessions in Montana. The technique was elegant in its simplicity. Enough pain to immobilize, not enough to cause injury or leave evidence. "Who are you working for?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the downpour. Maria's eyes widened, not with fear, but with recognition of his skill. She tried to pull away, but John increased the pressure slightly, causing her to wince. "Lieutenant Anna Johnson," she finally confessed, her voice trembling. "She approached me 2 weeks ago. She thinks Smith and Harrison are dangerous, that they're targeting you specifically." John maintained the hold, studying her face for deception. "And why would Anna care what happens to me?" "She served with your father," Maria explained, relief washing over her features when he finally released her wrist. "She says Smith and Harrison were involved in something terrible overseas. She wanted me to keep you safe, to watch for anything suspicious." Relief and suspicion battled within John's chest. Could Anna truly be an ally? Or was this another layer in a game whose rules he didn't fully understand? The young recruit remembered his father's warnings about trust in the military, how allegiances shifted like sand beneath desert winds. I need to meet with her, John decided, rubbing his temple. Not here, not anywhere they can monitor. Maria nodded, massaging her wrist. She said you might want that. There's a place off base where veterans gather. Murphy's. She can meet you there tomorrow night. John paced the small space between bunks, calculating risks. If Anna was genuine, she could provide crucial information about his father's disappearance. If she wasn't, if this was Smith's trap, he'd be walking into it willingly. Tell her midnight, he finally said. And Maria, if you're playing both sides, remember that I found you tonight, not the other way around. The female recruit's expression hardened. My brother died in service. I don't betray fellow Marines. As she slipped away, John sat on his bunk, turning his father's dog tags over in his palm. The meeting with Anna would be dangerous, but he needed to control the next move in this deadly chess match. Tomorrow night, he would finally get answers, or confirm that he was truly alone in his fight against whatever conspiracy had claimed Robert Calloway's life. Murphy's bar sat just beyond the base perimeter, its weathered facade and flickering neon sign a beacon for off-duty Marines seeking respite from military discipline. John Calloway pushed through the door at exactly 2100 hours, the smell of stale beer and decades of cigarette smoke hitting him immediately. The establishment was nearly empty on a Tuesday night, perfect for clandestine meetings. In the farthest corner booth, Lieutenant Anna Johnson sat nursing a glass of amber liquid, her normally pristine uniform replaced by civilian clothes. Beside her was a man John had never seen before, broad-shouldered, with a salt and pepper beard, and eyes that had witnessed too much. "This is Jack Murphy," Anna said quietly as John slid into the booth. "Owner of this fine establishment and former Force Recon. Served with your father in Desert Storm." Murphy nodded, his weathered face revealing little. "Robert Calloway was the finest Marine I ever knew," he said, his voice gravelly from years of shouting orders and smoking cigars. "What happened to him was murder, plain and simple." The bartender delivered bourbon for John without being asked. The three leaned closer, their voices barely above whispers, as Jack began unraveling the truth about Operation Mirage. "It was supposed to be humanitarian reconnaissance," the veteran explained, tracing patterns in condensation on the table. "Your father's team was sent to assess a village near Basra, but what they found was a testing ground." Anna picked up the thread. "Chemical weapons, experimental compounds. Not Iraqi, ours. A black ops program testing non-lethal crowd control agents that turned out to be anything but non-lethal. Smith and Harrison were there," Murphy continued, his eyes hardening. "Mid-level officers then, following orders from men who believed American interests justified any action. Your father documented everything, threatened to report it." John's hands tightened around his glass. "And they killed him for it." Anna nodded grimly. "Made it look like an enemy ambush. The official record says he died a hero." "He was a hero," Murphy insisted. "Just not the kind they wanted." The lieutenant slid a photograph across the table. 5 men in desert camouflage, arms around each other's shoulders. "Your father's team. 4 dead. 1 survivor. Michael Carter. Carty lives off-grid," she continued. "Mountain cabin about 3 hours north. He's damaged. The chemicals affected his nervous system, but his mind is clear, and he's kept evidence all these years." John studied the faces in the photograph, committing them to memory. "The flash drive my father sent home is the key to everything," Murphy finished. "But you need Carter's help to decrypt it. Smith and Harrison have built their careers on this cover-up. They'll do anything to protect it." Anna leaned forward, her voice steady. "We have one chance to get this right. Carter, the drive, and your father's service will finally see justice." John nodded, determination hardening his resolve. The path forward was clear, dangerous, and absolutely necessary. The next 3 days blurred into a desperate race against time. John Calloway barely slept, his mind constantly calculating risks as Maria Garcia worked her connections to arrange their unauthorized departure from base. They needed to reach Michael Carter, the last living witness who could corroborate everything. "We have a 4-hour window tonight," Maria whispered during evening formation. Anna's arranged transportation to the mountains. Under cover of darkness, they slipped away in a borrowed vehicle, driving north into the dense forests where Carter had hidden himself for years. The mountain cabin sat isolated among towering pines, its weathered exterior blending into the landscape. The perfect hiding place for a man who knew too much. Carter greeted them with a shotgun. His hollow eyes and trembling hands spoke of years spent looking over his shoulder, expecting Smith's men to find him. When John mentioned Robert Calloway's name, the old Marine's defenses crumbled. "Your father was a good man," Carter said, his voice rough from disuse. "The only one who tried to stop it when we realized what Mirage really was." Inside the sparse cabin, Carter retrieved a metal box from beneath floorboards. The contents represented everything John had searched for: a coded dog tag, the encryption key his father had designed, a handwritten journal documenting dates, locations, and participants in Operation Mirage, and photographs that placed both Smith and Harrison at the scene. "They tested experimental chemical agents on that village," Carter explained, hands shaking as he passed the evidence to John. "Your father threatened to report it. Next day, he disappeared. They told everyone he deserted." With the coded tag, John finally unlocked the flash drive he'd carried since his father's funeral. The screen filled with classified documents, mission parameters, and a video message from Robert Calloway himself, insurance against his own death. Their triumph was short-lived. Maria's phone bonned with a text from Sergeant Anna Johnson. "Smith knows. Contractors on base. Return impossible." Carter's face hardened. "They're using private security now. Mercenaries with no official ties to the Corps. If they catch you, you'll disappear just like your father." They spent the night planning their return, knowing the gauntlet that awaited them. At dawn, Anna called with a final warning. "Smith's brought in 4 contractors. They're authorized to use any means necessary to recover what you have. You've got one shot, John. Get that evidence to the Inspector General's office, or none of us get out alive." As they prepared to leave, Carter pressed his service pistol into John's hand. "Your father saved my life once. I couldn't save his. Don't let them win again." Rain drummed against the metal roof of the old boathouse as John Calloway crouched behind a stack of crates. The abandoned structure, at the edge of the Paris Island training grounds, had become the stage for the final confrontation. Through the grimy windows, he could see Staff Sergeant Michael Smith pacing, his massive frame silhouetted against the dim light, while Colonel Paul Harrison barked orders to 3 men in civilian clothes, private contractors brought in for their discretion and deniability. "They're here," whispered Sergeant Anna Johnson, her breath fogging in the cold air. "Remember, we need to get to my vehicle. The evidence goes straight to the Inspector General." John nodded, feeling the weight of his father's dog tags against his chest. Everything had led to this moment. The truth about Operation Mirage, the conspiracy that had claimed Colonel Robert Calloway's life, and the men who had built careers on the bodies of the innocent. They moved silently toward the rear entrance, but a floorboard creaked beneath Anna's boot. In an instant, the boathouse erupted into chaos. 2 contractors burst through the door, weapons drawn. John's training took over, not the Marine Corps drills, but the techniques his father had taught him on those cold Montana mornings. He moved with fluid precision, redirecting the first man's momentum and sending him crashing into a stack of equipment. The second contractor swung wildly, but John slipped beneath the blow, striking upward with the heel of his palm. The man dropped, unconscious before he hit the ground. "Calloway!" Smith's voice boomed across the space as he emerged from the shadows, pistol leveled at John's chest. "You're just like your father, too stubborn to know when you're beaten." Harrison appeared behind Smith, his own weapon drawn. "We could have made this easy," the colonel said, his voice eerily calm. "A training accident. Unfortunate, but these things happen." John calculated his options, knowing he couldn't reach either man before they fired. But Anna had positioned herself in the shadows, and as Harrison swung his weapon toward John, she fired. The colonel crumpled, clutching his shoulder and howling in pain. Smith turned, momentarily distracted. Giving John the opening he needed, he lunged forward, disarming the staff sergeant with a technique that would have made his father proud. As Smith fell to his knees, the boathouse doors burst open. United States Marine Corps Inspector General's office, weapons down. The team swarmed in, led by a stern-faced woman in uniform. Behind them stood Jack Murphy, the grizzled veteran's expression grim but satisfied. "Perfect timing," Anna said, holstering her weapon. "We have everything. The drive, Carter's journal, all of it." As agents secured Smith and the wounded Harrison, John stood in silence, watching the rain wash away years of deception. The conspiracy that had claimed his father's life was finally exposed, the cover-up finished. For the first time since he'd stepped off that bus at Paris Island, John felt the weight on his shoulders begin to lift. 6 months later, John Calloway stood at the front of the training facility, his father's dog tags hanging beneath his crisp uniform. The morning sun filtered through the windows, illuminating the faces of 24 new recruits who had no idea of the storm that had swept through Paris Island. The investigation had rocked the entire Marine Corps to its foundation. Michael Smith, Paul Harrison, and their co-conspirators now sat behind bars, facing military tribunals for crimes that spanned nearly a decade. The truth has a way of surfacing, John thought as he surveyed the room. Michael Carter had been vindicated, his testimony corroborated by the encrypted files on the flash drive. The village in Iraq that had suffered under Operation Mirage finally received acknowledgement, compensation, and medical aid for the survivors. Colonel Robert Calloway's name had been cleared, his sacrifice recognized with a posthumous commendation. John's mind drifted back to that pivotal day during his final evaluation. Smith, cornered and desperate after the investigation began, had arranged one last demonstration to humiliate the recruit who had brought him down. The staff sergeant had sent 5 instructors, Johnson, Davis, Brown, Miller, and a specialist brought in specifically for the occasion, against John in what was supposed to be a standard combat exercise. "Show us what you've got, Calloway," Smith had sneered, certain that numbers would prevail against size. 28 seconds later, all 5 men lay on the training mat. John had moved with a fluid precision that left witnesses stunned. The first 2 instructors went down with joint locks so swift they barely had time to register the pain. The third and fourth collided with each other as John redirected their momentum. The specialist, a decorated fighter, lasted 3 seconds longer before a perfectly executed sweep sent him crashing to the floor. Maria Garcia, now in her final phase of training, had witnessed it all. "That's when the whispers started," she later told Anna Johnson over coffee at Murphy's. "That's when everyone realized who John really was." Jack Murphy had laughed when he heard the story, raising his glass in a toast to his old friend Robert. "Like father, like son," the veteran had said. Now, as John faced his new class of recruits, he noticed the diversity before him, men and women of different sizes, backgrounds, and strengths. He touched his father's dog tags briefly before speaking. "Never judge a warrior by their size or their silence," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "Judge them by their heart, their skill, and the courage to do what's right." The legacy of Robert Calloway lived on, not just in his son, but in every recruit who would dare to stand for truth, no matter the cost.